The galaxy had a problem, not the kind of problem you could solve with a strongly worded diplomatic message, or a trade embargo, or even a very disappointed council vote. No, this was the kind of problem that came with teeth and claws and a hunger that didn't negotiate. The Vreth Dominion had crossed the Solvan expanse, consumed 3 colony systems in 11 rotations, and was now pressing hard against the outer rim of the Conclave's most populated sectors. The kind of problem, in short, that required something the Conclave of aligned worlds had spent 400 years carefully, deliberately, and very smugly avoiding. They needed warriors. Real ones. My name is Orval Thesson, Senior Intelligence Analyst for the Conclave's 7th Diplomatic Arm, and I was in the room when the decision was made. I want that on record. I want every single species in this galaxy to understand that I, personally, objected. I filed 17 formal complaints. I submitted a 40-page risk assessment. I even brought visual aids. None of it mattered, because when the Vreth are burning your outer colonies and your best military option is the Peluvian Defense Fleet, a group of beings whose most recent combat experience involved a border dispute over fishing rights, you stop listening to the analysts and you start making very different kinds of decisions. You start looking at humanity. Now, before I explain what happened next, let me give you some context about the humans, because if you haven't encountered them before, nothing I'm about to say will make any sense. Humans are a Class 4 biological species from a single, unremarkable planet in a mid-arm spiral galaxy. They have no natural armor, no venom, no enhanced sensory organs, no regenerative biology, no psionic capability whatsoever. They are, on paper, one of the least physically impressive species to ever achieve interstellar travel. Medium height, medium build, soft, warm-blooded, distressingly fragile-looking. And yet, somehow, these creatures spent the first 200,000 years of their existence in a state of near-constant war with each other, with their environment, with anything, really, that looked at them sideways. They invented weapons before they invented writing. They developed siege tactics before they developed indoor plumbing. They looked at every other apex predator on their planet, every creature with natural advantages that dwarfed their own, and they hunted most of them to extinction or domestication, not because they needed to after a certain point, just because the option was there. The Conclave had been quietly monitoring Earth for about 60 years before first contact. Standard protocol. We watch, we assess, we determine compatibility with civilized galactic society. Every species gets evaluated. Most pass. Humans required a longer assessment period, and a second committee, and then a third, after the second committee reviewed what the humans had done during what they called their 20th century and collectively needed a moment. But that's ancient history. The relevant part is this. Humanity had been a provisional member of the Conclave for 32 years. They'd been, by most measures, behaving themselves, mostly. There were incidents. There are always incidents with humans. But they'd signed the accords. They'd reduced their independent military operations to what they called a reasonable level, and they'd been genuinely, almost suspiciously, enthusiastic about galactic citizenship, which is why, when Fleet Admiral Cora Vostine of the Conclave Emergency Council stood up in that meeting room and said they were going to formally request human military assistance against the Vreth Dominion, the reaction in the room was mixed. "You want to invite them to a war," said Ambassador Priel of the Solvan Collective, in the same tone one might say, "You want to invite a fire to your house." "We want to invite them to our war," Vostine said, like that distinction mattered. There's a difference. There is not a difference. I want that noted also. The formal request was transmitted to Earth's Unified Defense Council on a Tresday. I know this because I drafted the transmission myself, under protest, with 17 addendums outlining the potential risks of the operation. The response came back in 4 hours. 4. The Peluvians took 6 weeks to respond to a catering request. Humanity responded to an invitation to fight an interstellar war in 4 hours, and the response was, and I am quoting directly from the official record, "We're in, send coordinates, what are we working with?" Not, We'll need to consult our government bodies. Not, we have conditions. Not even, could you elaborate on the threat level? Just, we're in, send coordinates. What are we working with? I poured myself something strong and went home. Commander Yael Oduya had been sitting in a briefing room on Luna Station for approximately 40 minutes before she decided she didn't like the Conclave liaison's face. This wasn't personal, it was professional. The liaison, a tall, four-armed Peluvian named Vreth Dominion, had spent the first 39 minutes explaining in extraordinary detail why the Vreth Dominion was an unprecedented threat, why conventional military approaches had failed, and why the situation was, statistically speaking, quite dire. Yael had spent those 39 minutes reading the actual tactical data on her tablet because she was a grown adult who could process both inputs simultaneously, and because Vreth Dominion had a habit of pausing for dramatic effect at moments that didn't require dramatic effect. And so Commander Dominion concluded, folding two of his forearms across his chest in what was apparently a Peluvian gesture of grave sincerity. We are asking humanity to contribute a forward strike element, something mobile, something aggressive, something that can operate in contested space without full fleet support. Yael looked up from her tablet. How many? She asked. Nal blinked. All four of his eyes did it at slightly different times, which was one of those things that was technically fascinating and practically unsettling. We anticipated some discussion of terms first. Terms are fine. How many soldiers are you asking for? The Council's initial projection was 3,000. Yael nodded slowly. Then she looked across the table at her logistics officer, Major Demi Favreau, who was already typing. Then she looked at her tactical chief, Colonel Ren Boateng, who was already pulling up deployment rosters. Then she looked back at Nal. We can do 15,000 in the first wave, she said, with full equipment. We'd want integrated command structure, access to your supply lines, and forward operating rights in contested zones. Demi, what's our staging time? Favreau didn't look up. 6 weeks for full deployment. 2 weeks if we pull from active readiness units. 2 weeks, Yael said, and smiled at Nal with the particular smile of someone who had just said something very simple that was going to change the nature of his entire day. Vreth Dominion stared at her for a long moment. You said 15,000. First wave, Yael confirmed. Did you want more? Because we can do more. It gets logistically interesting after about 60,000, but interesting isn't a deal breaker. Nal excused himself for 20 minutes. I know this because he called me from a corridor outside the briefing room and said, in a voice that was doing its absolute best to remain professional, Orval, they said 15,000, first wave, in 2 weeks. I filed 17 complaints, I reminded him. He hung up. The first human units arrived in the Solvan expanse on a cold, dark stretch of space near the system-designated Outpost Kelvar 9, and I was there because I am apparently the kind of analyst who makes poor personal decisions. The Conclave observation vessel I was aboard held position at a respectful distance, which I had specifically and emphatically requested, and which Fleet Commander Vostine had agreed to with a look that suggested she found my caution endearing. I watched the human transport vessels drop out of transit, and I want to describe this carefully so you understand the full picture. Human warships do not look like Conclave vessels. Conclave design philosophy, across most member species, trends toward elegance. Smooth lines, efficient geometries. Ships that look like they were designed by people who had given significant thought to the aesthetic experience of space travel. Human ships look like someone handed the contract to a very angry engineer who had been in several arguments that morning and wasn't finished yet. They are blocky, heavily plated, covered in weapon systems that appear, in several cases, to have been added as afterthoughts or arguments won. The vessel designations alone, painted on their hulls in large, uncomplicated lettering, told you a great deal about the species piloting them. The flagship was called the Indomitable, its escort ships were called the Relentless, the Unyielding, and, Memorably, the "do not test me." "What is that last one?" asked my assistant. A young Keth named Varan, peering at his scanner, read out. "A warship name," I said. "It sounds like something you say to a small child." "Yes," I said, "it does." The Vreth had a forward patrol group operating near Kelvar 9, about 40 vessels, which was considered a light incursion force by Dominion standards. Light by their standards meant 40 ships capable of cracking a moon. The Conclave's standing response doctrine was to maintain distance, report the position, and wait for a full fleet engagement to be organized, which typically took between 2 and 4 weeks, which was also typically how long it took the Vreth to finish whatever they were doing and leave on their own terms. The humans looked at those 40 ships on their sensors, and I watched their fleet configuration change in real time as I tracked it from my observation post, and I want to walk you through what happened because it was, and I say this as someone who filed 17 complaints and would file 17 more, genuinely remarkable. They didn't wait for orders. They didn't form a defensive perimeter. They didn't request updated threat assessments. Yael Oduya's voice came over the open channel, calm and clear and entirely too relaxed for the situation, and said, "All wings, threaten sector. Standard engagement, don't let any of them get comfortable." And then 15,000 soldiers and a fleet of very angry-looking warships went to work. I had read the historical records. I had reviewed the combat simulations. I had written, in my 40-page risk assessment, an entire section on documented human military behavior that my committee had read with visible discomfort. None of it had prepared me for watching it in person. The Vreth Patrol Group had, by all accounts, never encountered humans in direct combat before. You could tell. The first thing that surprised them, based on intercepted Dominion communications that our translators were processing in real time, was the speed. Conclave vessels, when engaging a numerically comparable force, typically maneuver to establish firing lanes, coordinate shield harmonics, and exchange several rounds of long-range ordnance before anything gets genuinely dangerous. It is a measured approach, civilized even, the kind of combat doctrine that says, yes, we are fighting, but we are fighting with some dignity about it. Human vessels close to engagement range in approximately 90 seconds. Not optimal range, not preferred range, engagement range, meaning the range at which the weapons become most punishing, the range at which you are near enough to your enemy that missing becomes genuinely difficult, the range that every other species in the Conclave refers to, in their respective languages, by phrases that all translate roughly to extremely close or uncomfortably personal, or, in the case of the Peluvians, where you should not be. The Vreth commander, a Dominion warlord designated in our records as Vel Karath the Unbroken, a name that was already aging poorly, fired his first full broadside expecting the humans to scatter. Standard doctrine against an aggressive close advance is to punish the advance, force evasive action, break the formation, pick off the stragglers. It works. It has always worked. The Vreth had broken Conclave formations with this exact method 17 times in the current campaign. The humans didn't scatter. 3 ships took direct hits. Direct hits that by our damage assessment readouts would have forced any Conclave vessel into emergency retreat and damage control. The 3 human ships took the hits, adjusted their approach angles by a few degrees each, and kept coming. One of them, the Relentless, which was already earning its name, actually accelerated after taking damage, which prompted a full 2 seconds of silence on the Vreth command frequency before someone remembered to start talking again. Viran looked up from his scanner. "Did they just speed up after being shot?" "Yes," I said. "Why?" I thought about it. "I believe," I said carefully, "that they interpreted being shot at as a reason to get closer faster." Viran stared at his scanner for a while. "That is not a logical response." "No," I agreed, "it is not." Commander Yael Oduya was not thinking about logic. She was thinking about the Vreth formation's left flank, which had a gap in it approximately 3 ship lengths wide, which was either an oversight or a trap, and which she had already decided was going to be her problem to find out about personally. "Boteng," she said, not looking up from her tactical display. Colonel Ren Boteng answered from the adjacent station. "Already on it. 83rd and 91st are in position for the flank push. If it's a trap, we'll know in about 40 seconds. And if it is a trap, then we spring it faster than they expected and make it our trap." He said this with the particular confidence of someone who had, on at least 3 documented occasions, walked into ambushes and emerged from them having somehow turned the situation around through a combination of aggression and indifference to personal safety. Yael nodded. "Do it." The 83rd and 91st strike groups pushed through the gap at full drive, and yes, it was a trap, because of course it was, and yes, the Vreth had 3 concealed cruisers waiting on the other side, which was quite a nasty surprise, and the human response to finding 3 concealed enemy cruisers at point-blank range was to immediately engage all 3 simultaneously while calling for close support, which arrived in approximately 45 seconds, which was faster than the Vreth cruisers had apparently modeled for in their ambush planning. Vel'Karath the Unbroken sent a communication to his Dominion command post during this phase of the battle. "Our translators caught it," it said, roughly. "They don't stop. Request clarification on engagement protocol for enemies that don't stop." No clarification came in time to help him. "I want to be fair to the Vreth. They are not a small threat. They did not conquer 11 systems by being incompetent. Their technology is in several respects superior to Conclave standard. Their ships are larger, their weapons are more powerful at long range, and their commanders are experienced." Vel'Karath himself had won 4 major engagements in the past year. Against Conclave forces, he had never lost. He lost this one in 2 hours and 17 minutes, not because the humans outgunned him. They didn't, not on paper, not because they had superior numbers. It was 40 Vreth vessels against 22 human ones, plus the 3 cruisers from the ambush, so the numbers actually favored the Dominion throughout the engagement. He lost because human combat doctrine, as best I can describe it to someone who has never witnessed it, operates on a principle that seems to be, make the cost of fighting you so outrageously high that your enemy decides, somewhere in the middle of the engagement, that they would genuinely rather be doing something else. 11 Vreth ships were destroyed. 14 withdrew. The remaining 3, including Vel'Karath's command vessel, attempted to negotiate a disengagement. Yael let them go. She was already dealing with more interesting problems, specifically the 1,800 Vreth ground troops that had been staging on the surface of Kelvar 9's third moon before the naval engagement started, and who were now, technically, cut off from their fleet support and very aware of it. The ground component is where I stopped watching the live feeds and started reading the after-action summaries instead, because I am 53 years old and have a heart condition, and there is only so much a person can process in a single afternoon. Major Demi Favreau had been on the moon's surface for 6 minutes before she found the Vreth forward command post, which was an impressively fast discovery that she would later attribute to the fact that large military installations are difficult to hide, and she had very good boots for moving quickly over uneven terrain. The Vreth, to their credit, put up a serious defensive action. They had fortified positions, overlapping fields of fire, and numerical advantage against the initial landing force. By any reasonable calculation, holding the position long enough for extraction support to arrive was an achievable goal. The reasonable calculation did not account for Sergeant First Class Tomide Abubakar, who bypassed the fortified front entirely by going over a ridge that the Vreth had assessed as unclimbable. Assessed correctly, by the way, for about 97% of known species, and arrived at the rear of the command post with 11 soldiers and a very uncomplicated attitude toward the situation. It also did not account for Corporal Maifin Souza, who is someone I looked up afterwards specifically because her name appeared in 4 separate sections of the after-action report, and who had apparently spent the middle portion of the ground engagement doing things that the report described as improvised and outside standard tactical parameters and extremely effective, and we should probably have a debrief about this. I did not read the debrief. Some things you know are above your clearance level and also above your interest in sleeping well. The Vreth ground force surrendered after 40 minutes. 1,800 soldiers, heavily armed, surrendered to approximately 400 humans who had been on the moon's surface for less than an hour. The Vreth commander, a unit leader named Grak Sul, said to Favreau upon surrender through a translation matrix, "What are you?" Favreau thought about it for a moment. "Tired," she said. "We've been traveling for 2 weeks. You got any food in there?" Grak Sul had not anticipated this question. Back on my observation vessel, I was writing my preliminary report, and I was struggling with the summary section, because how do you summarize what I had just watched in language that makes sense to a conclave council that has spent 4 centuries building a civilization specifically designed to avoid this kind of thing? I tried several drafts. Human forces engaged a numerically superior Vreth patrol group and achieved decisive victory in under 3 hours. That was accurate. It also felt like describing a thunderstorm as some precipitation. The deployment of human military assets produced results significantly beyond initial projections. Also accurate. Initial projections had been cautiously optimistic about the humans maybe holding their position long enough for conclave reinforcements to arrive. The concept of the humans actually eliminating the Vreth force and securing the moon in the same afternoon had not appeared anywhere in the projection models. I settled, eventually, on the engagement at Kelvar 9 demonstrated that human forces operate outside standard threat modeling parameters, and that the Conclave's existing frameworks for assessing military effectiveness are insufficient for evaluating their capabilities. Dry, professional, completely failed to convey the experience of watching the Do Not Test Me accelerate toward a Vreth cruiser while already on fire from 2 direct hits. I sent the report. Then I sent a personal message to Fleet Admiral Vastine that said simply, "I need you to see the full combat footage before the council meeting." She responded 4 minutes later, "Already watching it. Orval, where have these people been?" "On their planet," I replied. "Being kept out of exactly this kind of situation. We should have called them sooner." I thought about my 17 complaints. I thought about the 40-page risk assessment. I thought about the visual aids. "Perhaps," I wrote back, "the broader campaign against the Vreth Dominion lasted another 14 months. I am not going to walk you through all of it, partly because this account would never end, and partly because after Kelvar 9, the shape of things became somewhat predictable, in the way that a landslide is predictable once it has started. Word spread through the Dominion faster than the humans themselves advanced, which is saying something, because they advanced quickly. A species that had never encountered humans in combat, the Vreth, found itself repeatedly encountering a military force that did not behave like any enemy in their recorded history. Forces that were supposed to break under pressure pressed back harder. Positions that were supposed to fall held. Retreats that were supposed to be exploited turned into counter-engagements that the retreating Vreth somehow lost. Commander Oduya's forces liberated 4 contested systems in the first 6 months. Boteng's tactical group pushed through the Dominion's secondary line in month 8, in an operation that the Conclave's own strategists had classified as high-risk, extended timeline, meaning they thought it would take a year and might not work. It took 3 weeks. Favreau's logistics operation supporting the advance was, by month 10, being cited in Conclave military academic circles as a case study in mobile supply doctrine, which is an extraordinary thing to say about a logistics chain that Favreau herself described in an interview as chaotic but functional mostly. Sergeant Abubakar received the Conclave's Cross of Valor in month 11, at a ceremony that he attended in full dress uniform, looking slightly uncomfortable in the formal setting, which is a deeply human thing to be uncomfortable at a ceremony honoring your extraordinary competence in violence. Corporal Sousa was promoted twice. The Vreth Dominion's warlord Velkarath the Unbroken, he had by this point been broken fairly thoroughly, in both a literal and a reputational sense, agreed to a ceasefire in the 14th month. The formal negotiations were held on neutral ground, in a station above the Conclave's capital system. I attended as a conclave observer. The Vreth delegation entered the room and, for the first time, sat across a table from Commander Yael Oduya in a setting that was not on fire. Vel Karath looked at her for a long moment. He was a large creature by most standards, heavily built, the kind of physical presence that tends to influence a room. He looked at Oduya, who was, by his standards, quite small, and who was reviewing her notes with the calm, focused expression of someone working through a moderately complex administrative task. "You fought the Dominion across 14 systems," he said, through the translation matrix, "with what we assessed as inferior numbers in most engagements." Oduya looked up. "We work with what we have. You do not fight like you value your own lives." She considered this for a moment. "We value them fine," she said. "We're just not precious about them." The distinction appeared to trouble him, which was, honestly, a reasonable response. I filed my final report on the Kelvar campaign on a quiet afternoon, back in my office at the Conclave's 7th Diplomatic Arm. It was a long report, thorough. I am told it has since become required reading for Conclave strategic planners, which I find either vindicating or deeply concerning depending on my mood. The summary section, which I rewrote 4 times, reads as follows: "Humanity's involvement in the Kelvar campaign produced outcomes that the Conclave's existing models could not have reliably predicted, because those models were built on assumptions about what biological entities without natural advantages will do when pressed against threats that exceed their physical limitations. Those assumptions are incorrect when applied to humans. Humans do not appear to have a reliable threshold at which they decide a situation is no longer survivable and adjust their behavior accordingly. They appear, instead, to assess survivable situations and unsurvivable situations by roughly the same metric, which is, we have not stopped yet, so we keep going. This is alarming. It is also, in the current strategic environment, extraordinarily useful. The Conclave should not have needed monsters for this war. The fact that we did is a failure of our own preparation, and the fact that the monsters answered when called, and answered well, and answered without hesitation, is something we should sit with very carefully. They are members of this conclave. They signed the same accords. They attended the same diplomatic functions and filed the same trade paperwork and sent representatives to the same interminable council sessions. And then, when the situation required something that the rest of us had carefully and deliberately and very smugly designed ourselves not to be, they became exactly that thing, without losing a single piece of what they also were. I don't know what to do with that. I'm not sure any of us do. But I know this. When the Vreth came, and the fishing rights fleet was not enough, and the diplomatic messages went unanswered, and the outer colonies burned, we called humanity, and humanity came. I stand by every word. My name is Orval Thesson. I filed 17 complaints. I would file 17 more, and I have never, in 53 years of service, been so glad to have been so thoroughly ignored.